The Saturday morning light filtered through the dust motes suspended in Walter Brennan's workshop, casting long shadows across workbenches worn smooth by 50 years of labor. The scent of oak shavings and linseed oil hung in the air like a prayer mingling with the distant sound of a child's laughter drifting in from the backyard garden. Michael Brennan sat on a wooden stool that his father had built before he was born, watching those calloused hands move across the surface of an unfinished rocking chair with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. At 68 years old, Walter Brennan still possessed the quiet strength of a man who had spent his entire life building things that would outlast him, and there was something almost sacred about the way he worked, as if each stroke of the sandpaper was a conversation with the wood itself. Sophie's voice carried through the open window, high and bright, calling out to the neighborhood cat that sometimes wandered into the garden. She was 7, now old enough to have opinions about everything, and young enough to believe that the world was fundamentally good. Michael watched his father's hands pause for just a moment at the sound, and in that pause he saw something that took his breath away, the same expression of wonder and love that Walter had once worn when watching Michael play in this very same yard 3 decades ago. The workshop occupied the converted garage of the house where Michael had grown up, a modest 2-story colonial in the western suburbs of Chicago that Walter had purchased in 1974 with money saved from his first 5 years of carpentry work. Every piece of trim in that house had been replaced by Walter's own hands. Over the years, every cabinet refinished, every squeaky floorboard silenced. It was a house that had been loved into permanence, the kind of place that absorbed the memories of everyone who passed through its doors and held them safe in its walls. Michael shifted on the stool and the wood creaked beneath him. His father's eyes flickered up for just a moment, blue-gray and sharp, despite the lines that time had carved around them, before returning to his work. "You're thinking too loud again." Walter's voice was gravel and honey roughened by decades, but warm at its core. "I can hear it from here. Just watching you work, Dad. That's not what's making all that noise in your head, and we both know it." Michael didn't respond immediately. There was no point in lying to his father, there never had been. Walter Brennan had an uncanny ability to read people, a skill he claimed came from his years in Vietnam, where understanding the intentions of those around you was often the difference between living and dying. Michael had inherited some of that ability, had honed it during his years on the police force, but he had never quite matched his father's effortless perception. The rocking chair was taking shape now, its curved runners already smooth enough to catch the light. Walter had started it 3 weeks ago, working on it only on Saturday mornings when Sophie was here to keep him company. He called it her chair, said he wanted to build something that would hold her when she was old enough to hold her own children. "I was thinking about the restaurant," Michael finally admitted what his father already knew. "About tonight's shift." "The restaurant." Walter set down his sandpaper and straightened his spine, cracking with the effort. "That what we're calling it now, the restaurant? What else would I call it? Your job, the thing you do instead of the thing you were meant to do." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the quiet morning. Michael felt his jaw tighten, an old reflex that he had never quite learned to control. His father had never directly criticized his decision to leave the police force, had never said the words that Michael sometimes imagined in his darker moments. But there were times like now when the silence between them held more weight than any accusation ever could. "I serve people their dinners, Dad. I make sure their water glasses stay full. It's honest work." Never said it wasn't honest. Walter reached for a different grade of sandpaper, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Just said it wasn't what you were meant to do." Through the window, Sophie's laughter rang out again. She had found a butterfly, now was chasing it through the tomato plants with the kind of joyful abandon that only children could muster. Michael watched her for a moment, this small person who had become the center of his entire universe, and felt the familiar ache of responsibility settle into his chest. "What I was meant to do got someone hurt, Dad." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way that surprised him. He had never said it quite like that before, never admitted aloud the weight that he carried every single day. Walter's hands stilled on the rocking chair, and for a long moment, the only sound in the workshop was the distant hum of traffic on the main road. "Let me tell you something about meant to do." Walter turned to face his son fully, and in his eyes, Michael saw something that looked almost like pain. "When I was 19 years old, I was meant to be in college, studying to become an engineer like my father wanted. Instead, I was in a jungle on the other side of the world carrying a rifle and trying not to die. Did I choose that? No, but it became what I was meant to do because I was there and because I had to find a way to survive it. Michael had heard fragments of his father's war stories over the years, small pieces offered up like communion wafers during moments of connection. But Walter rarely spoke about Vietnam with any real depth, preferring to let the past stay buried beneath layers of sawdust and varnish. The thing about purpose, son, is that it doesn't care about our plans. It finds us whether we're looking for it or not. And when it does, we've got two choices: we can run from it or we can face it. I'm not running, Dad. No, Walter raised an eyebrow, a gesture so familiar that Michael could have drawn it from memory. Then what do you call 3 years of pouring water and clearing plates? The question hung between them unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Michael wanted to argue, wanted to defend the life he had built for himself and Sophie, but the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep down in the place where he kept the truths he couldn't face, he knew that his father was right. Sophie burst through the workshop door, her dark hair wild with leaves and her cheeks flushed from running. In her cupped hands, she held something small and struggling. Grandpa, look. Her eyes were enormous with wonder. I caught a beetle. It's so pretty. Look at its shell. Walter's entire demeanor transformed in an instant, the weight of their conversation falling away like snow from a rooftop. He bent down to Sophie's level, his knees popping in protest, and examined the beetle with the same careful attention he had given to the rocking chair. That's a beautiful beetle, sweetheart. See how the light catches its shell? That's called iridescence. Iridescence. Sophie repeated the word carefully, tasting its syllables. Can I keep it? What do you think the beetle would want? Sophie considered this question with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. Her small face scrunched in concentration, and Michael felt his heart swell with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She was so much like her mother, in moments like this, thoughtful, empathetic, always considering the world beyond herself. I think, Sophie looked down at the beetle, then back up at her grandfather. I think it probably has a family, and it would miss them if I kept it. I think you're probably right. Okay, Sophie nodded decisively. I'll put it back. But first, can you take a picture so he can remember it? Walter glanced at Michael, who was already reaching for his phone. The moment was captured in a series of quick shots, Sophie's tiny hands cradling the beetle, her smile wide and genuine, Walter's weathered face soft with adoration. These were the images that Michael would carry with him through the long nights at the restaurant, the proof that his life had meaning even when it felt small. After Sophie had released the beetle back into the garden, with a solemn goodbye, she returned to the workshop and climbed onto Michael's lap. Her weight was familiar and grounding, her scent, a mixture of grass and the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using. Daddy, yeah, sweetheart, are you sad today? The question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Sophie had always been perceptive, had inherited that quality from both sides of her family. Michael wrapped his arms around her and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. What makes you ask that? Sometimes you get this look. Sophie traced a line down her own face, mimicking an expression she must have seen on his. Like you're remembering something that hurts. Michael glanced at his father, who had returned to his work on the rocking chair with pointed deliberation. The old man's silence was a gift, a space in which Michael could find his own words without interference. Sometimes I think about things that make me a little sad. Michael chose his words carefully. But then I look at you and I remember all the things that make me happy. And the happy things are bigger than the sad things. Sophie considered this with the seriousness that she brought to all important matters. That's good, because I don't like it when you're sad. I don't like it either. So maybe you should think about the happy things more. Maybe I should. She wriggled off his lap and went to examine the rocking chair, her small fingers tracing the curves of the wood. Walter showed her how to feel for rough spots, explained in simple terms the process of transforming a tree into a piece of furniture that someone would cherish for generations. Sophie listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed a mind already hungry for understanding. Michael watched them together, his daughter and his father, 2 generations on either side of his own, and felt something shift in his chest. For 3 years, he had been living in a kind of stasis, frozen by the weight of a single night that had shattered his confidence in himself. He had convinced himself that retreating was noble, that hiding was safe. But watching Sophie lean into her grandfather's patient teaching, watching her absorb the lessons that would shape who she became, he began to wonder if he was teaching her the wrong things. What kind of example was he setting by running from his mistakes? The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of family. Walter finished the rough sanding on the rocking chair and began explaining to Sophie how he would stain the wood to bring out its natural beauty. Michael helped prepare lunch in the kitchen, moving through the familiar space with the ease of long practice. The house held memories in every corner: his mother's handwriting on the labels in the spice cabinet, the notches on the door frame where his growth had been marked each birthday, the squeaky third step that Walter had never fixed because Margaret had loved the way it announced visitors. Margaret Brennan had died of cancer 8 years ago in the spring when the garden was just beginning to bloom. Michael had been with her at the end, had held her hand as she slipped away, and had watched his father age 10 years in a single afternoon. The grief had nearly broken. Walter had sent him into a silence so deep that Michael feared he might never find his way back out. But somehow, through the patient work of his hands and the stubborn persistence of love, Walter had rebuilt himself. He had emerged from that darkness not unchanged but undefeated. Michael often wondered if he had inherited any of that resilience, or if his father had gotten all of it. After lunch, Sophie demanded a trip to the park, and the three of them walked the familiar route together. The neighborhood had changed over the decades, new families moving in old houses being renovated. The corner store replaced by a coffee shop, but the essential character remained the same. It was a place where people knew each other's names, where children still played in the streets, where life moved at a pace that allowed for breathing. At the park, Sophie made a beeline for the swings, and Michael found himself pushing her higher and higher while she shrieked with delight. Walter sat on a nearby bench, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to see his legacy continue into the next generation. "Higher, Daddy," Michael pushed again, feeling the strain in his shoulders but unwilling to stop. Sophie's laughter was medicine, was oxygen, was everything good that remained in a world that sometimes felt too heavy to bear. Again. When she had finally tired of the swings, Sophie ran off to join a group of children on the climbing structure, and Michael sat down beside his father. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Your mother would be proud of you." The words came out of nowhere, unexpected and devastating. Michael felt his throat tighten, and he had to look away to compose himself. For what waiting tables? For raising that child? For getting up every morning and doing what needs to be done even when it hurts? For not giving up even when you wanted to? Walter's voice was steady, certain. "Your mother always said that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and showing up anyway." Michael watched Sophie navigate the climbing structure with growing confidence, her small body strong and capable. She was so much braver than he was, so willing to try new things and risk failure. When had he lost that willingness? "I've been hiding, Dad. I know that. I just don't know how to stop." "You stop by stopping." Walter shrugged as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You wake up one morning and you decide that today is the day you start living again. And then you do it. And then you do it again the next day and the day after that until it becomes who you are." "What if I fail again?" "You will." There was no comfort in Walter's voice, only truth. "Everyone fails. The question isn't whether you'll fail, it's what you'll do when you do. Will you let it destroy you, or will you let it teach you?" Sophie was at the top of the climbing structure now, waving at them with both hands, her smile visible even from this distance. Michael waved back, and something in his chest began to loosen. "I have a shift tonight." "I know. Friday nights are always busy. Lots of executives celebrating deals, couples on anniversary dinners." "I know. There's a woman who comes in twice a week, a CEO. She always sits alone." Walter's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. "She reminds me of someone, but I can't figure out who. She's got this wall around her, you know. Like she's built it so high that even she can't see over it anymore." "Sounds lonely." "Yeah." Michael nodded slowly. "I think it is." The afternoon wore on, and eventually it was time to return to Walter's house. Sophie helped her grandfather water the garden while Michael gathered their things, and then they said their goodbyes. The ritual was familiar. Sophie hugging Walter's legs, Walter pressing a kiss to her forehead, the unspoken understanding that they would do this again next weekend, and the weekend after that for as long as they were able. On the drive back to their apartment, Sophie chattered about the beetles and the butterflies and the rocking chair that Grandpa was building just for her. Michael listened and responded in all the right places, but part of his mind was already turning toward the evening ahead. Friday nights at Le Mirage were a particular kind of performance. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, all floor-to-ceiling windows and soft lighting and jazz piano drifting from the bar. It was a place for people who had made it, who had climbed to the top of whatever mountain they were climbing and wanted to celebrate their success with a $300 bottle of wine and a steak that cost more than Michael made in a shift. He had been working there for 3 years now, ever since he had turned in his badge and walked away from everything he thought he was. The job paid the bills, allowed him to pick Sophie up from her after-school program every afternoon before his shifts started, gave him enough stability to build a life that, if not happy, was at least functional. Mrs. Gallagher was waiting for them when they arrived home. She was 64 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had become something like family over the past 3 years. She watched Sophie on the nights when Michael worked, fed her dinner, and helped with homework, and put her to bed at 8:30 with a story and a kiss. In return, Michael paid her what he could afford and made sure her sidewalk was always shoveled in winter. "How was your day with Grandpa?" Sophie launched into an enthusiastic recounting of the beetle and the rocking chair, while Mrs. Gallagher listened with genuine interest. Michael slipped into his bedroom to change into his uniform, black pants, white shirt, black vest, and tried to prepare himself mentally for the shift ahead. The face that looked back at him from the bathroom mirror was older than he remembered. At 35, he should still be in his prime, but the weight of the past 3 years had carved lines around his eyes and salted his temples with early gray. The beard he had grown wasn't a fashion choice. It was camouflage, an attempt to look different from the clean-shaven officer he had been. Most customers never really looked at him anyway. That suited him fine. Before he left, he knelt down to Sophie's level and wrapped her in a hug. She smelled like grass and strawberries, and her small arms around his neck were the best thing he had felt all day. "I love you, sweetheart. Be good for Mrs. Gallagher." "I'm always good." "I know you are. That's why I love you." "When will you be home?" "Late, but I'll check on you when I get in." "Okay, I'll kiss your forehead, and you probably won't even wake up." "I'll try to stay awake." "You don't have to do that." "I know." Sophie's smile was impish already, so like her mother's. "But I want to." He kissed her one more time, and then he was out the door, driving through the gathering dusk toward the glittering towers of downtown Chicago. The traffic was heavy, as it always was on Friday evenings, and he used the time to switch mental gears to put away the father and the son and become the invisible servant that the job required. Le Mirage was already filling up when he arrived. The hostess, a young woman named Amanda, who was working her way through graduate school, gave him a quick smile as he passed. The kitchen was in controlled chaos, prep cooks shouting and flames leaping from the line. Mr. Fontaine, the manager, stood at his post near the entrance, surveying his domain with the eagle eye of a man who noticed everything and forgave nothing. Michael checked his section tables 6 through 12, the middle of the dining room, and began his pre-shift preparations. Fresh linens, polished silverware water glasses without spots. The work was mindless, but not without satisfaction. There was something almost meditative about creating order, about making everything perfect, for people who would never notice the effort that went into it. By 7:30, the restaurant was in full swing. Michael moved between his tables with the quiet efficiency that had become his trademark, anticipating needs before they were expressed, appearing and disappearing as seamlessly as a ghost. A table of lawyers ordered their third bottle of wine and grew progressively louder. A couple in the corner held hands across the table, lost in each other, barely touching their food. A businessman ate alone, his phone pressed to his ear throughout the meal, his voice a constant low murmur of deals and deadlines. At exactly 8 o'clock, the front door opened and Victoria Chen walked in. She moved through the restaurant with the unconscious authority of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about whether she belonged. Her dark suit was immaculately tailored, her black hair pulled back in a tight bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She acknowledged the hostess with a brief nod, declined to have her coat checked, and made her way directly to table 12 in the far corner, her usual spot. Michael watched her settle into her chair, the way she positioned herself with her back to the wall facing the room. It was a tactical choice, the kind of thing a cop or a soldier might do instinctively. He wondered what in her past had taught her to always know where the exits were. He collected the bottle of sparkling water she always ordered and carried it to her table. She looked up as he approached, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Hers were dark brown, almost black, and contained a depth that he couldn't quite read. "Good evening, Miss Chen." She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than warmth. "Thank you." He poured her water, placed the bottle on the table, and retreated without attempting conversation. She had already turned her attention to the iPad propped against the small vase of orchids, her fingers moving across the screen with the focused intensity of someone reading bad news. Michael returned to his other tables, but part of his attention remained fixed on the corner. Victoria Chen had been coming to Le Mirage for about a year now, always twice a week, always alone. In that time, he had formed certain impressions of her, the way she ordered without hesitation, ate efficiently, and left generous tips without making eye contact. She treated every interaction as a transaction, which he had come to understand was a form of respect. Some customers expected their servers to be entertainers, therapists, potential conquests. Victoria Chen expected nothing except competence, and that was in its own way refreshing. But tonight something was different. There was a tension in her shoulders that he hadn't seen before, a tightness around her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. She was dealing with something difficult, something that was weighing on her even here in this sanctuary of quiet luxury that she visited twice a week. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Michael glanced around to make sure Mr. Fontaine wasn't watching, and then checked the message. Sophie's face filled the screen, grinning at the camera. Behind her, he could see Mrs. Gallagher's apartment, the familiar floral wallpaper, and the shelf of ceramic cats that Sophie found endlessly fascinating. The text below the photo read, "I drew a picture of our family. I'll show you when you get home." Michael's heart clenched with that particular mixture of love and guilt that had become his constant companion. He typed a quick response, "Can't wait to see it, love you," and slid the phone back into his pocket. 3 more hours until his shift ended. 3 more hours until he could hold his daughter and pretend for a little while that the world made sense. The front door opened again. Michael's attention shifted automatically, part of the job, the constant awareness of who was entering and what they might need. But the 4 men who stepped inside made him stop moving entirely. They weren't dressed for Le Mirage. Work boots, jeans, jackets that had seen better days. One of them wore a Carhartt coat faded from rust to salmon paint stains, visible on the sleeves. They stood just inside the entrance, not waiting to be seated, not moving toward the bar, just standing and scanning the room with the kind of focused intensity that made the hair on Michael's neck stand up. The hostess approached them with her professional smile, but they weren't looking at her. Their eyes swept the dining room like searchlights, hunting for something specific. And then the tallest of them, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, found what he was looking for. His gaze locked onto Victoria Chen's table, and his expression transformed into something sharp and cold and dangerous. Michael felt a familiar sensation crawl up his spine. It was the same alertness he used to get on patrol, the instinct that separated routine calls from situations about to turn violent. He had tried to bury that instinct when he left the force 3 years ago, had done his best to forget the way his body could read danger in the angle of a shoulder or the rhythm of a breath. But apparently it hadn't gone anywhere. The 4 men moved past the hostess without waiting to be seated, their footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. They took a table near Victoria's 4 chairs, scraping loudly against the floor. Other diners glanced over with mild irritation at the noise. Michael picked up a water pitcher and moved closer, using the excuse of refilling glasses at a nearby table. He kept his movements casual, positioned himself where he could hear fragments of their conversation while appearing to do his job. "That's her." The tall one, the leader, spoke in a voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Chen Ventures. That's the CEO. You sure?" The youngest of the group, barely 30 with nervous energy, that manifested in hands that wouldn't stop moving. "I memorized her face from the news. That's Victoria Chen." "So what do we do? Just sit here?" "We let her know." The third man built like someone who had spent years doing physical labor. "We let her see what her decisions cost." Michael's grip tightened on the water pitcher. He looked at Victoria. She was still focused on her screen, completely unaware of the attention focused on her. The soft lighting made her look almost fragile despite the severity of her expression, like someone who had learned to armor herself against a world that kept hitting back. He needed to think. These men weren't here for dinner. Their energy was all wrong, the collective tension of people working themselves up to something. But what could he do, call Mr. Fontaine, get them kicked out based on a feeling they hadn't done anything yet? Except Michael had seen this before. The stillness before the storm. The way angry men gathered courage from each other until someone made the first move. And then the tall one, the leader, looked directly at Michael. Their eyes met across the dimly lit restaurant. Something flickered across the man's face. Recognition. Michael's heart rate climbed. He looked away, moved back toward the kitchen, mind racing. He knew these men. Not well, not recently, but he knew them. A bar fight 5 years ago, a place called Rosie's on the south side. Michael had been first on scene, had broken it up before anyone got seriously hurt. They'd all spent a night in jail, paid fines. Nothing major. But the tall one, Frank, that was his name, Frank Donovan, had looked at Michael during the booking process and said something that had stayed with him. "I don't forget faces, Officer Brennan." Michael forced himself to breathe normally as he set down the water pitcher in the service station. Maybe Donovan didn't recognize him. Different hair, the beard 30 pounds heavier. People changed in 5 years. But even if Donovan did remember, this wasn't about Michael. This was about Victoria Chen. One of the 4 men stood up. The youngest Eddie, the one with nervous energy, barely contained. He walked toward Victoria's table. Michael's body moved before his mind caught up. He cut across the dining room, intercepting Eddie 3 steps before he reached Victoria. "Sir, can I help you with something?" He kept his voice light, professional, but positioned himself directly in Eddie's path. Up close, he could see the desperation in the young man's eyes, the kind that came from too many sleepless nights. "I need to talk to her. If you'd like to speak with another guest, I can pass along a message. Just get out of my way." Victoria looked up from her iPad, finally noticing the confrontation. Her expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded. Frank Donovan stood up from his table. The other 2 followed. Michael felt the situation crystallizing into something he couldn't walk away from. 4 against 1. A room full of civilians. A woman who had no idea she was in danger. All his training said to de-escalate, create distance, call for backup. But there was no backup here. Just him. A water pitcher still in his hand, and 3 years of rust on skills he'd tried to forget. Frank walked over, and now Michael could see the recognition settling fully into place on the man's face. "Wait, I know you." Michael met his eyes. There was no point in lying. "You should go back to your table." "You're that cop. Brennan, Michael Brennan." Frank's voice rose slightly. "You arrested us. Rosie's bar 5 years ago." The other 3 men looked at Michael with new attention. Eddie stepped back slightly, suddenly uncertain, but Frank moved closer. Small world. There was something between surprise and bitterness in his tone. "You're a waiter now. What happened? They fire you." Michael didn't respond. He could feel Victoria's eyes on him, calculating, trying to understand what was happening. "I asked you a question. I left the force. Now I'm asking you to sit down or leave the restaurant. You're disturbing other guests." "Disturbing?" One of the other men laughed bitterly. "That's rich. You know what's disturbing? Losing your job because some billionaire pulls their money out of your factory. 200 people unemployed. But sure, we're the problem because we're a little loud." Victoria stood up from her table. "What is this about?" Frank turned to face her fully. "You don't even know, do you, Chen Ventures? You pulled your investment from Morrison Manufacturing 8 months ago. You remember that decision?" Victoria's expression remained controlled, but Michael saw the slight tension in her shoulders. "That's business. The project wasn't profitable." "Business." Frank's voice dripped with contempt. "You sit here in your $1,000 suit eating meals that cost more than my weekly unemployment check, and you call it business?" Eddie found his courage again. "My wife left me because I couldn't pay the mortgage. You want to call that business too?" Michael raised his hand slightly, a calming gesture. "I understand you're angry, but this isn't the place." Frank looked at him with something like pity. "You understand you're taking orders from people like her now. You really think you understand?" For a brief moment, Michael wondered if Frank was right. Maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he'd taken the easy path, hiding in this job instead of facing the world that had broken him. But then he saw Victoria's hand trembling slightly as she gripped her iPad, and he remembered why he'd walked away from police work in the first place. He was tired of watching people get hurt. If you want to talk, we can do this the right way. Michael's voice dropped lower, stripped of the polite server tone. It came out with the authority he'd carried for 8 years in uniform. But you need to step back from her table, now. The word hung in the air between them. Something in Michael's posture had shifted without him meaning it to shoulders squared, weight, centered hands relaxed but ready. The muscle memory of a man who knew how to handle conflict. Frank studied him for a long moment. Michael watched the calculations happening behind those hard eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of risk. Finally, Frank nodded once. All right, Brennan, let's talk. Michael gestured toward the rear of the restaurant. There's a patio out back. We can talk there without disturbing anyone. The dining room had gone quiet. Other guests watched with the careful stillness of people trying not to get involved. Victoria remained standing by her table, her expression unreadable. Michael caught the eye of Sarah, another server working the floor. He tilted his head slightly toward the kitchen, their silent signal for trouble. She gave a barely perceptible nod and moved toward the back to alert the manager. The patio was technically a service area, a concrete square enclosed by brick walls where staff came to catch their breath between rushes. A few metal chairs sat scattered around a table someone had dragged out months ago. String lights hung overhead, half of them burned out. The cool night air carried the smell of grease from the kitchen vents. Michael held the door open as the four men filed out. Eddie kept glancing back at the dining room like he was already regretting this. The other two, Ray built like a linebacker and Tom lean with weathered hands, moved with the weary caution of men who'd learned to expect trouble. Frank was the last to step outside. He stopped in front of Michael. You really want to help us? Or are you just protecting your rich customers? Michael met his gaze. I want to stop this from getting worse. Too late for that. It's already worse, has been for 8 months. The door closed behind them, muffling the restaurant noise. Out here, the city's sounds took over distant traffic, a siren, several blocks away, the hum of air conditioning units. Michael pulled out one of the metal chairs. Sit if you want. I can get coffee, water, whatever you need. We don't need coffee. Frank stayed standing, arms crossed. We need that woman in there to understand what she did. Eddie finally spoke up. I'm Eddie Martinez. I worked at Morrison Manufacturing for 12 years. I was a welder. They put me on the specialty pieces, the custom orders that needed precision. I was proud of that work. Michael could see the exhaustion carved into Eddie's face, the kind that came from months of unemployment and shame. He remembered his father's words from that morning. When a man loses his job, he doesn't just lose income, he loses a part of himself. Ray sat down heavily on one of the metal chairs. Ray Kowalski, I fixed the machines when they broke. 20 years in that factory. Tom, the lean man with weathered hands, remained standing. Tom Hendricks, I ran the third shift. 52 people under my supervision. Michael absorbed this information. These weren't career criminals. They were working men who'd been hollowed out by circumstance. Frank pointed at Michael. And you remember arresting us? I remember. You were professional about it, didn't rough us up, didn't talk down to us. That's the only reason we're out here talking instead of causing a real scene. Frank's expression darkened. But don't think that means we trust you. You're still working for people like her. Tom spoke quietly. If we're sitting out here, we deserve to know who we're talking to. What happened to you? Why'd you leave the force? Michael looked at the four of them. Part of him wanted to deflect to keep his past buried, but another part was tired of hiding. I was with the Community Intervention Unit. The words came slowly, pulled from a place he rarely visited. We handled situations where someone needed to de-escalate before violence happened. I thought I was good at it. He met their eyes. Then I got called to a domestic dispute. Husband had been drinking. Wife was scared. I talked to him, thought I'd calmed him down. So I left. The night air felt colder. Michael could see it all again. The small house, the woman's eyes asking him not to go, his own confidence that he'd handled it. 2 hours later, she was in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a fractured jaw. He'd waited until I left. The silence that followed felt like understanding. So you get it. Frank finally sat down. What it's like to lose the thing you were good at. I get it. Eddie leaned forward. My wife left me 3 months ago. Took our son. Every morning I get up, put on work clothes, pretend like I'm going to a job. I drive to the library and fill out applications for 8 hours. Then I come home like I've been at work. Ray shook his head. My daughter had to drop out of college. She works at Target now. She tells me it's fine, but I see how she looks at me like I broke a promise. Tom's weathered hands were clasped together. When Morrison shut down, the 52 people on my shift asked me what to do next. They trusted me to have answers. He looked at Michael. I didn't have any. Michael felt the weight of their stories. This was what Victoria Chen couldn't see from her corner table, the human cost of business decisions. These men had built their identities around work that no longer existed. I understand why you're angry, but going after Victoria Chen won't fix anything. Frank's jaw tightened. So we're supposed to just accept it? No, but there's a difference between making her listen and making her a target. You came here ready to intimidate her. That won't help. Eddie stood up. We didn't threaten anyone. We just wanted her to see us. You wanted more than that. Michael kept his voice quiet. And I get that impulse. But think about what happens next. You confront her. Maybe it gets physical, maybe someone calls the cops. Then what, you spend the night in jail. You've got records now, and your families, the ones you're fighting for, they're worse off than before. The words landed. Michael watched the anger flicker and dim in their eyes, replaced by something more complicated. My father was a soldier. Michael wasn't sure why he was telling them this. Vietnam. He came back broken, spent years trying to put himself back together. One thing he taught me was that the things we do when we're angry, those are the things that stay with us longest. The things we regret. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Michael with something that might have been respect. Your father sounds like a wise man. He's a carpenter now, builds furniture in his garage, says working with his hands is what saved him. What saved you? Michael thought about the question. My daughter, knowing that whatever I did, she'd be watching. The patio door opened. Victoria Chen stepped out into the night air. Michael stood immediately. Miss Chen, you should go back inside. She ignored him, her attention fixed on the four men. I overheard part of your conversation. Morrison Manufacturing. I remember that decision. Frank rose slowly. The other three did the same. Victoria's voice remained steady. We pulled our investment because the factory was losing money. That's business reality. Business reality. Eddie's voice cracked. You keep using that phrase like it absolves you. I'm stating facts. Ray took a step forward. Here's a fact. 200 people lost their jobs. Not because they weren't working hard enough, because you decided the numbers didn't look good enough. Victoria's expression remained composed, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't used to being confronted like this. Did you ever come to the factory? Tom asked quietly. Before you pulled out. Did you ever meet the people working there? That's not how investment works. We reviewed data projections. So no, Tom interrupted. You never met us. We were just data to you. Something flickered across Victoria's face, maybe the first crack in her armor. If I visited every investment property, I'd never have time to run my company. But that's the point. Frank stepped closer. You run a company. We had lives, and you treated our lives like they were disposable. Michael moved between them. Ms. Chen, why did you come out here? She looked at him, and for the first time since he had started serving her, he saw uncertainty in her eyes. Because the waiter who served me water for a year just revealed he used to be a police officer. Because 4 men showed up claiming my decisions destroyed their lives. Because nothing about tonight makes sense. What makes sense, Frank said, is that you're finally seeing the consequences of your choices. Victoria turned to face him. And what were you planning to do before this man stopped you? The question hung in the air. Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. We just wanted to talk. Eddie finally said, you wanted to intimidate me. 4 men approaching a woman dining alone. You knew exactly what that would feel like. Frank's expression hardened. Good. You should know what it's like to have your security taken away. Michael stepped forward again. That's enough. Both sides. He looked at Frank, then at Victoria. Everyone here has a story. Everyone here has pain. But we can either keep hurting each other or we can try to understand. The string lights overhead cast uneven shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren faded away. Victoria broke the silence first. I didn't know. Her voice was softer now, almost uncertain. I don't think about the people behind the numbers, because if I did, I'd never be able to make hard choices. That's what I tell myself anyway. She looked at the four men, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked 16-hour days in a laundry his whole life so I could go to college. He died of a heart attack while pressing someone's shirts. Her voice caught slightly. He worked until his last breath, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself that what I was building honored his sacrifice. That success meant I wasn't wasting the gift he gave me. Frank's stance softened almost imperceptibly. What gift? Opportunity, the chance to become something. But maybe I became the wrong thing. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Maybe in trying to be strong, I forgot how to be human. The words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised everyone else. Michael watched the transformation happening, walls coming down, defenses crumbling, a human being emerging from behind the armor of a CEO. Tom spoke quietly. My father was an immigrant too, from Poland after the war. He worked in a foundry for 40 years. Ray nodded. My grandfather was a coal miner, 50 years underground. Eddie looked down at his hands. My father was a welder. He taught me everything I know. Frank was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. My father died in Vietnam. I never knew him. The connection was unexpected and undeniable. 5 people from different worlds, all carrying the weight of those who had come before. Michael thought of Walter, of the rocking chair he was building, for Sophie, of the lessons passed from generation to generation. There's a workforce development program at Chen Ventures. Victoria's voice had steadied. We train people for new industries, help them transition to growing sectors. If you're willing to retrain, I can get you into the program. It covers tuition and provides a stipend during training. Eddie looked skeptical. What kind of training? Renewable energy installation, advanced manufacturing, logistics management. Depends on your background and what's available. Why would you do that? Ray asked. Victoria met his eyes. Because tonight someone reminded me that behind every business decision are human beings. And because making this offer cost me less than living with the knowledge that I could have helped and chose not to. Tom spoke quietly. The 52 people from my shift, can they join too? Yes. Frank still looked skeptical, arms crossed, but Michael could see something shifting in his expression, not trust actuality, but maybe the beginning of hope fighting against bitterness. And what do you get out of this? Victoria smiled without warmth. I get to sleep at night. That's worth something. The 4 men exchanged looks. Michael stayed quiet, letting them process. Finally, Eddie nodded. Okay, I'll try it. Ray followed. Me too. Tom simply said, yes. All eyes turned to Frank. He stood silent for a long moment, jaw tight. Then his shoulders dropped slightly. Fine, but I want it in writing. You'll have a formal offer by Monday. Victoria's voice was steady again, but there was something new in it, something that sounded almost like hope. The tension that had filled the patio began to ease. It wasn't perfect resolution, too much damage had been done for that, but it was something. A fragile agreement built on exhaustion and the slimmest thread of possibility. Frank stepped toward Michael and extended his hand. You're all right, Brennan. Michael shook it. I need to get back inside before my boss fires me. As the 4 men headed toward the exit, Eddie stopped and looked back at Victoria. Thank you. His voice was barely above a whisper. I know you didn't have to do this. Victoria nodded once. Then they were gone, disappearing into the Chicago night. Michael and Victoria stood alone on the patio. The sound of the restaurant filtered through the door, dishes clattering, muted conversation, the normal rhythm of a night that had been anything but normal. You could have called the police. Victoria's voice was curious rather than accusatory. Why didn't you? Because I've seen what happens when you treat desperate people like criminals. It doesn't fix anything. It just creates more desperation. Is that why you left the force? I left because I stopped trusting myself. Because I made a mistake that cost someone dearly, and I couldn't face the possibility of making another one. Victoria studied him with open curiosity. But tonight you trusted yourself. You stepped in, talked them down. Didn't hesitate. I didn't have time to hesitate. Or maybe you didn't need it. Maybe the hesitation was the problem, not the solution. Michael didn't know how to respond to that. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had once held a badge that now carried water pitchers and cleared dirty plates. I should check on my tables. Of course. Victoria moved toward the door, then stopped. Mr. Brennan, Michael, thank you. For what? For seeing them as people. For seeing me as one too. She paused. We spend so much time building walls, we forget there are people on the other side. You reminded me of that tonight. She went inside, leaving Michael alone with the city noise and his own thoughts. He stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain away. His hands were steady now, his breathing even. For 3 years he'd been hiding. Tonight all of that had come rushing back, the training, the instinct, the part of himself he tried to bury. And for the first time since he'd turned in his badge, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like himself. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Michael moved through the dining room on autopilot, clearing Victoria's table, refilling water glasses, smiling at customers who had no idea what had just happened on the patio behind them. Mr. Fontaine gave him a hard look at one point, but said nothing. Sarah covered his tables during his absence without asking questions. At 11:15, as the last customers were lingering over dessert, Michael's phone buzzed. Another photo from Sophie, her drawing of their family. 3 stick figures holding hands, a son in the corner, flowers everywhere. She always drew 3 people, even though it was just the 2 of them. He stared at the picture for a long moment, feeling something shift in his chest. Maybe she was drawing what she hoped for. Maybe she was showing him what could be if he was brave enough to reach for it. The drive home was quiet, the streets empty at this hour. Michael's mind kept returning to the events of the evening, Frank's anger, Victoria's vulnerability, the unexpected connection that had formed on that cramped patio. His father's words echoed in his memory. The things we do when we're angry, those are the things that stay with us longest. But tonight, something different had happened. Instead of anger leading to destruction, it had led to conversation. Instead of walls, there had been bridges. Mrs. Gallagher was asleep on his couch when he got home, a Korean drama playing softly on the television. He touched her shoulder gently, and she woke immediately, alert despite the late hour. Sophie, perfect as always, homework done, dinner, eaten, asleep by 8:30. Mrs. Gallagher gathered her things. How was your night? Michael thought about the question. Complicated, but okay. Complicated can be good sometimes. Means things are changing. After she left, Michael looked in on Sophie. She was asleep in her small bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and books, her dark hair spread across the pillow. One hand curled near her face. She looked peaceful in a way that made his chest ache. He pulled the blanket up gently and kissed her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake. In his own room, Michael sat on the edge of the bed. The drawing Sophie had made was still on his phone screen. 3 figures, a house, flowers, sunshine. It was so simple, so full of hope. For 3 years, he'd let one mistake define him. He'd convinced himself that stepping back was noble, that avoiding responsibility was safe. But watching his daughter's drawing, seeing the family she wished for, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong. His phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. This is Victoria Chen. Mr. Fontaine gave me your contact. I'd like to speak with you when you have time. No pressure, but I have a proposition that might interest you. Michael stared at the message. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to keep his life simple, but another part remembered his father's words from that morning. The question isn't whether you'll fail, it's what you'll do when you do. He typed a response, I'm free tomorrow afternoon if that works. The reply came immediately, 2 p.m. I'll send you the address, and Michael, thank you again for tonight. He set the phone down and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The city lights glowed through his window. Somewhere out there, Frank Donovan and his friends were probably still awake, processing what had happened. Victoria Chen was probably doing the same in her penthouse or wherever she lived. And Michael Brennan, former cop, current waiter, single father of a 7-year-old girl who drew families of 3, was lying in his bed, wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The last thought he had before sleep took him was of his father's hands smoothing the wood of a rocking chair meant for a granddaughter who believed in hope. Sunday morning arrived with the particular quality of light that only early autumn in Chicago could produce, golden and slanting, full of promise and melancholy in equal measure. Michael woke before his alarm, his body still running on the adrenaline residue of the night before, and lay in bed for a long moment, letting the events replay in his mind. Sophie was still asleep, her door slightly ajar the way she liked it. He could hear her soft breathing from the hallway as he made his way to the kitchen to start coffee. The apartment was small but clean, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a living room that doubled as a dining area. The furniture was secondhand, chosen for function rather than style, but Sophie had added her touch everywhere. Drawings taped to the refrigerator, a collection of interesting rocks on the windowsill, a parade of plastic dinosaurs marching across the bookshelf. This was the life he had built after everything fell apart. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't what he had imagined for himself when he was young and full of certainty, but it was his and it was safe and Sophie was happy. Was that enough? The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the kitchen with a smell that had become synonymous with morning. Michael pulled out his phone and looked again at Victoria Chen's message. 2 o'clock today. An address in downtown Chicago. A proposition that might interest him. He didn't know what to expect, didn't know if he was ready for whatever she was offering. But something his father had said kept echoing in his mind. You wake up one morning and you decide that today is the day you start living again. And then you do it. Maybe today was that morning. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, hair wild from sleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. Daddy, you're awake. I'm awake, sweetheart. You hungry? Starving. He made pancakes the way he did every Sunday morning when he wasn't working. Sophie helped him mix the batter, standing on a step stool to reach the counter, her small hands gripping the wooden spoon with determined concentration. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from long familiarity. After breakfast, they packed their things for the weekly visit to Walter's house. Sophie chattered the whole drive about her drawings and her plans for the garden and whether Grandpa's rocking chair was finished yet. Michael listened and responded, but part of his mind was already on the meeting ahead. Walter was waiting for them in the driveway, a cup of coffee in his hand and sawdust on his jeans. He hugged Sophie first, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she shrieked with laughter. Then he turned to Michael with that knowing look that always made him feel like a boy again. You look different this morning. Do I? Something happened last night. It wasn't a question. Michael wondered if he would ever stop being amazed by his father's ability to read him. Something happened. I'll tell you about it later. Walter nodded, accepting this without pressing. Sophie, your grandmother's roses need checking. Why don't you go see if any of them are blooming? Sophie ran off toward the garden with the boundless energy of childhood. Michael followed his father into the workshop, where the rocking chair sat waiting its form, now clearly visible, just needing the final sanding and staining. It's beautiful, Dad. It's getting there. Walter ran his hand along the curve of the back. Wood takes its time. Can't rush it. Like people? Exactly like people. Walter sat down on his workbench stool and gestured for Michael to take the other. So, what happened? And Michael told him. All of it, the 4 men, Victoria Chen, the confrontation on the patio, the unexpected resolution. His father listened without interrupting, his eyes steady and thoughtful. When Michael finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. You did good. I don't know what I did. I just reacted. That's what good training does. It makes the right reaction automatic. Walter picked up a piece of sandpaper and began working on a rough spot on the rocking chair's arm. Your mother always said you had a gift for seeing people, not through them, into them, the real them underneath all the armor they put on. Mom said that many times. She was proud of you, Michael, prouder than she ever told you. Michael felt his throat tighten. Even after 8 years, the grief could still catch him off guard. I miss her. I miss her too, every day. Walter's hands kept moving the sandpaper, making its soft shushing sound. But she's still here in a way, in the lessons she taught you, in the way you raised that little girl out there, in the kind of man you've become. I haven't become much of anything, Dad. I'm a waiter. You're a father. That's the most important thing a man can be. Walter looked up, his eyes sharp. And last night you were a peacemaker. That's the second most important thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the rhythm of Walter's work. Through the window they could see Sophie exploring the garden, probably looking for more beetles to catch and release. She sent me a message. Michael's voice was quiet. Victoria Chen, she wants to meet with me this afternoon. Says she has a proposition. Walter's hand stilled. What kind of proposition? I don't know, but I'm curious. Curious is good. Curious means you're still alive and they're still reaching for something. I'm scared, Dad. The admission came out before Michael could stop it. Walter set down his sandpaper and turned to face his son fully. What are you scared of? That whatever she's offering, I'll fail at it. That I'll make another mistake, hurt someone else. Let me tell you something about mistakes. Walter's voice was quiet but firm. I made plenty of them in Vietnam, decisions that got people killed. And for a long time after I came home, those mistakes were all I could see when I closed my eyes. Michael had never heard his father speak so directly about the war. What changed your mother? When I met her, she saw me, not the soldier, not the broken man, but me. And she made me believe that I could be more than my worst moments, that I could choose every day to be better than I was the day before. Walter reached out and gripped Michael's shoulder. You're my son. You've got your mother's heart and my stubbornness. Whatever this woman is offering you, you're capable of rising to meet it. I believe that. The only question is whether you do. Sophie burst through the workshop door, hands cupped around something. Grandpa, I found a caterpillar. It's so fuzzy. The moment shifted the weight of the conversation, giving way to the lightness of childhood wonder. Walter examined the caterpillar with the same serious attention he gave to everything, and Michael watched them together, his father and his daughter, 2 generations on either side of his own. This was what mattered. This was what he was fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start fighting again. The afternoon came quickly. Michael dropped Sophie off with Mrs. Gallagher, explaining that he had a meeting but would be back in a few hours. Sophie hugged him tight before he left, her small voice serious. Good luck, Daddy. How do you know I need luck? Because you're wearing your nice shirt. He laughed despite his nerves and kissed her forehead. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. The drive downtown was a blur of familiar streets and racing thoughts. The address Victoria had sent led to a sleek glass tower in the financial district, the kind of building that seemed to exist in a different world from the apartment complexes and corner stores of Michael's neighborhood. Chen Ventures occupied the entire 15th floor. Michael gave his name to the receptionist, a young woman with a polished smile, and was directed to wait in a sitting area with leather chairs and abstract art that probably cost more than his car. 10 minutes later, Victoria appeared. She was dressed more casually than at the restaurant. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked younger this way, less like a CEO and more like a person. Thank you for coming. She shook his hand firmly. My office is this way. He followed her through a maze of cubicles and glass-walled conference rooms. The office was quiet for a Sunday, but there were still people working, their faces lit by computer screens. Victoria's private office sat in the corner, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The desk was nearly bare, just a laptop, a cup of coffee, and a single framed photograph. From this angle, Michael could see it was a picture of Victoria with an older Asian man, both of them smiling in what looked like a restaurant kitchen. My father. Victoria followed his gaze. Opening day of the laundry he ran for 30 years. He saved every penny to send me to business school. Never got to see what I built with it. He passed away. Heart attack 12 years ago. He was pressing someone's shirts when it happened. Victoria sat down in one of the chairs arranged in front of the desk, gesturing for Michael to take the other. I keep that photo to remind myself where I came from. Sometimes I forget. Last night was one of those times. Last night was a wake-up call. She was silent for a moment. I've been thinking about what happened on that patio, about those men and their stories and the way you handled the situation. I just did what seemed right. That's exactly my point. Most people would have called security. Most people would have gotten them arrested. You saw human beings in crisis, and you responded with humanity. That's rare. Michael shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. What's this about Ms. Chen? Victoria. Victoria, you said you had a proposition. She stood and walked to the window, her silhouette outlined against the city below. I've built a successful company. Chen Ventures manages over $2 billion in investments. We have 100 employees, partnerships with companies across the country, a reputation for smart, profitable decisions. She paused. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what my father taught me. That business isn't just about numbers. It's about people. She turned to face him. I want to hire you. Michael's heart stuttered. For what? Community relations manager. Your job would be to interface between our investments and the communities they affect, to be the person who sees the human impact of our decisions before those decisions get made. I'm not qualified for that. I don't have a business degree. I don't know anything about corporate structure. You're qualified because you know how to listen, because you see people instead of problems. Because last night you did something that none of my Harvard-educated analysts could have done. You made four angry men feel heard. Victoria pulled a folder from her desk and handed it to him. This is the job description and compensation package. Take it home, think about it. No pressure. Michael opened the folder. The salary figure made his stomach drop more than 3 times what he made at the restaurant. This is competitive, yes. I want you, Michael. I want what you can bring to this company. He closed the folder and looked at her. Why me, really? Because my father had a saying, when you hire people, don't hire skills, hire character. Skills can be taught, character cannot. Victoria sat back down closer to him now. Last night I saw character. I saw someone who could have stayed invisible, could have let things play out, could have protected himself. Instead, you stepped into the fire because it was right. That's who I want working for me. Michael sat with his folder in his hands, feeling the weight of possibility it represented. A new life, a new chance, but also new ways to fail. Can I have time to think about it? Take as long as you need, but Michael, don't let fear make this decision for you. Fear is a terrible advisor. He left the building with the folder tucked under his arm and his mind spinning. The drive home felt longer than usual. The familiar streets somehow strange, as if he were seeing them for the first time. At home, Sophie was waiting with a new drawing, this one of a castle with a princess and a dragon. She showed it to him with great seriousness, explaining the story behind each element. Michael listened and praised and hugged her, but part of him was elsewhere trying to process what had just happened. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of him. The job description was full of corporate language, stakeholder engagement, community liaison, social impact assessment, but beneath the jargon, he could see what Victoria was really asking. She wanted him to be the conscience of her company, to be the voice that spoke for the people behind the numbers, to make sure that no decision was made without understanding its human cost. It was in a way exactly what he had been trained to do as a cop, just in a different context with different tools. His phone buzzed, a text from his father. Well, Michael smiled. Nothing got past Walter Brennan. She offered me a job, good money, real work. And I'm thinking about it. There was a long pause before Walter's response came. Your mother would tell you to trust yourself. I'm telling you the same thing. Michael put down the phone and looked around his small apartment. The second-hand furniture, the drawings on the refrigerator, the quiet sounds of Sophie sleeping in the next room. This was the life he had built by playing it safe. It was comfortable, predictable, secure, but it was also small, limited, defined by fear rather than hope. His father's words echoed in his mind. The question isn't whether you'll fail, it's what you'll do when you do. He had failed before. He had made a mistake that changed someone's life forever, that haunted him still. But hiding from that failure wasn't protecting anyone. It was just another form of giving up. Michael looked at the folder one more time. Then he picked up his phone and typed a message. I don't need time. The answer is yes. He hit send before he could change his mind. Victoria's response came 3 minutes later. Welcome to Chen Ventures. See you Monday morning. And Michael, thank you for giving me a chance to make things right. Michael set the phone down and stood at the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were struggling with problems he couldn't see yet. But soon he would be in a position to help them, to make sure their voices were heard before they reached the point of desperation. And maybe in doing so, he would find his way back to himself. The first day of his new life would begin in less than 12 hours. He should be terrified. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He felt ready. In her bedroom, Sophie stirred in her sleep and murmured something he couldn't quite hear. Michael went to her door and watched her for a moment, this small person who had become his reason for everything. He was doing this for her, for the future she deserved, for the man he wanted to be when she looked at him. But he was also doing it for himself, for the chance to believe again that the world could be better, that he could make a difference, that the mistakes of the past didn't have to define the possibilities of the future. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, in this quiet apartment with his daughter sleeping peacefully and his father's faith warming his heart, Michael Brennan made his choice. He chose to hope. The night deepened around Chicago, the city's endless lights flickering against the autumn sky. In a penthouse overlooking the lake, Victoria Chen sat at her home office desk, staring at Michael's message on her phone screen. Something had shifted in her that night on the patio, something she had kept locked away for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph worn at the edges from years of handling. Her father, young and proud, standing in front of the laundry on its opening day. His smile was the smile of a man who believed that hard work and decency would be enough. "I forgot, Ba." Her voice was barely a whisper, "but I'm remembering now." She put the photograph away and turned to the window. Somewhere in the city, four men were processing what had happened, hopefully beginning to imagine new possibilities for themselves. Somewhere, a former cop was preparing to take a leap of faith. And somewhere, a little girl was sleeping, dreaming dreams that her father would do anything to protect. The connections between them were invisible but real threads of consequence and choice that bound them all together in ways they couldn't fully understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to fail or succeed. But tonight, something had begun that couldn't be undone, a turning toward hope, a reaching across the divides that separated people from each other. Victoria Chen, who had built walls so high she could no longer see over them, had finally found someone willing to help her tear them down. And Michael Brennan, who had spent 3 years hiding from his own potential, had finally found a reason to step back into the light. The story was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the particular anxiety that accompanies all major life changes. Michael woke before dawn, his body refusing to let him sleep despite the late night, and lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the city coming awake. He had laid out his clothes the night before, not the waiter's uniform he had worn for 3 years, but a button-down shirt and khakis, the closest thing he had to professional attire. He showered, shaved carefully around his beard, and examined himself in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him was the same and different. Same tired eyes, same lines around the mouth, same gray at the temples. But something in the set of his jaw had changed, something in the way he held his shoulders. He looked like someone preparing to fight. Sophie was still asleep when he finished dressing. He made her breakfast and left it in the refrigerator with a note, then arranged with Mrs. Gallagher to take her to school. The routine was familiar, but today it felt weighted with significance, the last morning of the old life, the first morning of the new. The drive downtown was easier than usual, the traffic lighter at this early hour. Michael parked in a garage several blocks from the Chen Ventures building and walked the rest of the way, using the time to steady his nerves. He didn't know what to expect from this first day. He didn't know if he would succeed or fail, if the skills he had once possessed still worked, if Victoria's faith in him was justified. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was done hiding. The building's lobby was all marble and glass, designed to impress visitors with the wealth and power of the companies it housed. Michael showed his temporary ID badge to the security guard and took the elevator to the 15th floor. Victoria was waiting for him in the reception area. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Michael smiled slightly. "I wasn't either, but here I am." "Here you are." She led him through the office, introducing him to the people they passed: account managers, analysts, administrative staff. Everyone was polite, professional, curious about the new face. Michael shook hands and repeated names, knowing he would forget most of them within an hour, but determined to try. His office was small but private, a glass-walled space in the corner of the main floor. A desk, a chair, a computer, a phone, the bare essentials of a new beginning. "We'll get you set up with everything you need." Victoria stood in the doorway, watching him take in his new surroundings. "But first, I want to show you something." She led him to a conference room where a presentation was already cued on the screen. The title slide read, "Morrison Manufacturing Post-Investment Analysis." I had my team pull together everything we know about what happened after we pulled our investment. Victoria clicked to the next slide. 212 employees lost their jobs. Average age 47, average tenure 15 years, average time to find new employment 11 months. The numbers were stark and damning. Michael felt the weight of them settle into his chest. 63% of those workers are still unemployed or underemployed. 17 divorces, 4 bankruptcies, 1 suicide. Victoria's voice was steady, but Michael could see the cost of that steadiness in the tension around her eyes. We did this, I did this, and I didn't even know. She clicked to the final slide, a simple list of names. 212 names, each one a person whose life had been upended by a decision made in a boardroom by people who would never meet them. I want this on the wall of your office. Victoria turned to face him. I want you to see it every day. I want it to remind you and remind me why we're doing this. Michael nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? Because this job isn't going to be easy. You're going to be the person who tells us things we don't want to hear. You're going to slow us down, make us think twice, force us to consider consequences we'd rather ignore. Some people here will resent you for it. I'm not worried about being resented. Good. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Because I'm counting on you to be honest with me, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the task ahead settling over them both. I should introduce you to the team you'll be working with. Victoria moved toward the door. And then you have a lot of reading to do. We have 17 active investments right now. I want you to understand every one of them by the end of the week. Michael followed her out of the conference room, his mind already beginning to organize the work ahead. 17 investments to learn, 212 names to remember. A company to transform one decision at a time. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was exactly what he had been waiting for. The first week passed in a blur of reading meetings and questions. Michael devoured every report, every analysis, every piece of data he could find about Chen Venture's investment portfolio. He learned about profit margins and market trends, about due diligence, and exit strategies, about all the ways that money could flow through the economy, creating and destroying value along the way. But he also learned about people. He requested the names of employees at every company Chen Ventures had invested in. He studied the communities where those companies operated, the schools, the hospitals, the small businesses that depended on local employment. He began to build a mental map of the human ecosystem that surrounded every investment decision. Victoria checked in with him every afternoon, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. She asked questions about what he was learning, offered context where needed, and really listened to his observations. You notice things other people miss. She said this at the end of his first week when he had pointed out that a proposed factory expansion would displace a community garden that had been serving a local food bank. That's exactly what I need. It's just paying attention. It's more than that. It's caring about what you're paying attention to. Most people look at data. You look at stories. Michael thought about that comment as he drove home that Friday evening. Stories. That was what his father had always said about carpentry, that every piece of wood had a story, and the craftsman's job was to listen to it to understand what the wood wanted to become. Maybe business was the same. Maybe every investment was a story waiting to be told, full of characters and conflicts and consequences that rippled out far beyond the balance sheet. Sophie was waiting for him when he got home already in her pajamas, but refusing to go to bed until he arrived. Daddy, you're late. I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry. That's okay. I drew you a picture. She handed him a sheet of paper covered in crayon marks. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing, a building tall and imposing with a tiny figure standing in front of it. The figure had brown hair and was smiling. That's you at your new job. Sophie pointed to the figure. I made you happy because Mrs. Gallagher said you seem happier now. Michael felt his eyes sting. He knelt down and pulled Sophie into a tight hug. I am happier, sweetheart, because of you. I know. Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, full of the easy confidence of childhood. That's why I drew you with a smile. He tucked her into bed that night, telling her the story she requested, the one about the princess who saved herself instead of waiting to be rescued. It was her favorite, and she mouthed some of the words along with him, having heard it so many times she knew it by heart. After she fell asleep, Michael sat in his small living room and looked at her drawing, the happy figure outside the tall building. The future she was imagining for them both. He was going to make it real. Whatever it took, he was going to make it real. Saturday morning brought the familiar routine of breakfast with Sophie and the drive to Walter's house. But this time Michael had stories to share, stories about his new office, his new colleagues, the work he was beginning to understand. Walter listened the way he always did, with patience and attention, his hands busy with the rocking chair that was nearing completion. Sophie played in the garden, her laughter drifting through the open window. "Sounds like you found your place," Walter said when Michael finished. "It feels that way. It feels like I'm supposed to be there." "That's because you are." Walter set down his tools and turned to face his son. "You spent 3 years convincing yourself that you were broken, that the mistake you made defined who you were. But you were never broken, Michael. You were just lost. And now you're finding your way back to yourself, to the man you were always meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon light slanting through the dusty windows of the workshop. "Dad, can I ask you something? Anything? That story you told me about Vietnam, about the man who saved your life, what happened to him?" Walter was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't know. I tried to find him after the war, but the records were incomplete. The village was destroyed. Most of the people were scattered." He paused. "I think about him sometimes. Wonder if he survived, if he found happiness, if he ever knew what he did for me. You never told me his name." "Nguyen Van Min." Walter spoke the words carefully, reverently. "He was a farmer. He had a wife and 3 children, and he risked everything to save an American soldier he had no reason to care about. Why did he do it? Because it was right, because he saw a human being who needed help and he couldn't walk away." Walter looked at his son. "That's what you did, Michael. On that patio with those men, you saw human beings who needed help and you couldn't walk away. That's who you are. That's who you've always been." Michael felt something shift in his chest, the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. "I understand now." His voice was quiet. "Why you told me that story. Why you've been waiting for me to be ready. I've been waiting for you to see what your mother and I always saw. A man with the courage to care about strangers. A man willing to step into the fire because it's right. A man who can make a difference if he chooses to. I choose to, Dad. I'm choosing to." Walter smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then go make a difference, son. And when it gets hard, because it will get hard, remember this: you are the son of a soldier and a saint. You were born for battles worth fighting." Sophie burst through the door holding something in her cupped hands. "Another beetle?" Michael asked, smiling. "No, a butterfly. Look at its wings." They examined the butterfly together, 3 generations gathered around a small miracle of nature. And in that moment, Michael understood what his father had been trying to tell him. Life was made of these moments: choices to care, decisions to love, courage to hope. The rest was just details. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Michael arrived early, worked late, and slowly began to earn the respect of his colleagues. His role was unusual. He wasn't involved in finding investments or managing money, but in asking questions that no one else thought to ask. What would this factory closure mean for the surrounding community? How many local businesses depended on this employer? Were there alternatives that could achieve profitability without destroying livelihoods? At first, some of the analysts resented him. They saw his questions as obstacles, delays in the pursuit of profit. But gradually, as they saw how Victoria valued his input, attitudes began to shift. "I never thought about it that way." A young analyst named Marcus said this after Michael explained why a seemingly profitable decision would devastate a small town's only major employer. "I just looked at the numbers. The numbers are important, but there's always a story behind them. How did you learn to see that?" "I used to be a cop. My job was to understand people, to see what they weren't saying. The same skills apply here." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's actually kind of amazing. It's just paying attention. Anyone can learn it if they try. Victoria observed these interactions with quiet satisfaction. She had taken a risk in hiring. Michael had put her reputation on the line for a man with no business experience. But every day he proved that her instincts had been right. He was exactly what the company needed, what she needed. The test came 2 months into his tenure. Chen Ventures was considering a major investment in a tech startup that promised revolutionary returns. The numbers were spectacular. The due diligence was impeccable. Everyone was ready to move forward. Everyone except Michael. He had spent a week investigating the company, talking to employees, researching the community where their operations were headquartered. And what he found gave him pause. The company's labor practices were questionable. Employees worked long hours for modest pay with high turnover and low morale. The community had zoning concerns about expansion plans. There were whispers of environmental violations being swept under the rug. He brought his findings to Victoria in a private meeting. The numbers look great, but the reality doesn't match. Victoria reviewed his report in silence, her expression unreadable. This investment represents a significant opportunity. We could make $20 million and destroy lives in the process, the same pattern we saw at Morrison Manufacturing. You're asking me to walk away from $20 million. I'm asking you to make a decision based on more than money. The silence stretched between them. Michael could see the conflict in Victoria's eyes, the CEO battling with the daughter of a laundry worker, the businesswoman struggling against the human being. If we pass on this, there will be questions. From the board, from investors. Then we explain why. We make it a statement of values, not just a business decision. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real smile, the first Michael had ever seen from her, that reached all the way to her eyes. You're right, we pass. Just like that. Just like that. Victoria leaned back in her chair. My father built his business one customer at a time, treating each one with respect and honesty. He died with nothing in his bank account but a name that meant something. That's what I want for this company. A name that means something. She stood and extended her hand. Thank you, Michael, for reminding me who I want to be. He shook her hand, feeling the significance of the moment. They had passed a test not just of the company, but of themselves. The news of the rejected investment spread through the office. Some people were surprised. Some were skeptical. But a growing few, understood what it meant. Chen Ventures was changing, becoming something more than just another investment firm, becoming the kind of company that considered the human cost of every decision. The months that followed brought more challenges, more tests, more opportunities to prove that values and profit could coexist. Michael became known throughout the company as the person who asked the hard questions and somehow made it safe to answer them honestly. He hired a small team to assist him, people chosen not for their business credentials, but for their capacity for empathy. Together, they developed protocols for evaluating the social impact of every investment, frameworks for engaging with affected community systems, for ensuring that the human cost was always part of the equation. And slowly the culture began to shift. Analysts who had once focused solely on numbers started considering consequences. Managers who had never thought about the lives behind the balance sheets began to see them. Victoria watched it all with a mixture of pride and wonder. You've changed us, she told Michael at a quarterly review. Changed me. You were ready to change. I just gave you permission. It's more than that. You showed me what was possible, what my father knew all along. Victoria paused. I've been thinking about him a lot lately, about what he would say if he could see what we're building. What do you think he would say? Victoria smiled, and there was something peaceful in it, something that looked like finally coming home. He would say, it's about time, daughter. It's about time. As the first year of Michael's new career drew to a close, he looked back at all that had changed. His apartment was better now, still modest, but in a safer neighborhood with a room for Sophie that was actually big enough for her growing collection of books and drawings. His relationship with his father had deepened, their weekly visits enriched by conversations about work and meaning and the lessons that passed from one generation to the next. And Sophie was thriving. She was in second grade now, reading above her level, making friends, bringing home stories about her days that made Michael's heart swell with love. Daddy, she asked one evening as he was tucking her into bed, are you happy? Very happy, sweetheart. Why do you ask? Because you smile more now. You used to have this sad look sometimes, but you don't have it anymore. Michael felt his eyes sting. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. You're right, I don't have it anymore. What happened to it? I think I finally learned to let it go, to stop being afraid of making mistakes and start being brave enough to try. Sophie nodded as if this made perfect sense. Good, I like you better when you're brave. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. He turned off her light and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her settle into sleep. This small person who had become his reason for everything. This child who saw him more clearly than he saw himself. For 3 years he had been hiding, running from a mistake from the fear of making another one. But somewhere along the way, on a patio behind a restaurant, in his father's workshop, in the offices of a company trying to become something better, he had found his way back. Not to who he was before the mistake, to who he was meant to become. The city lights glowed through Sophie's window, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. A world full of people struggling with problems he could help solve. A world where every day he was making a difference. Michael Brennan, former cop, former waiter, now something new. A man who had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and showing up anyway. It was about making mistakes and choosing to learn from them. It was about seeing the humanity in others and having the strength to act on what you saw. He closed Sophie's door gently and went to the window in the living room. The autumn night was clear, the stars visible, even through the city's glow. Somewhere out there, his father was probably in his workshop putting the finishing touches on the rocking chair that would hold Sophie for years to come. Somewhere, Victoria was probably still at her office, working to build a company that would honor her father's memory. And somewhere, Frank Donovan and his friends were building new lives, proving that it was never too late to start over. All of them connected, all of them part of a story that was still being written. Michael stood at the window for a long moment, breathing in the night air, feeling the weight of the pain and the promise of the future. Then he turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to fail, and new chances to succeed. But tonight he was at peace, and that was enough. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 14 months after Michael had walked through the doors of Chen Ventures for the first time. He was in his office reviewing impact assessments for a proposed investment in a logistics company when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was one he had not expected to hear again. Mr. Brennan, this is Captain Rodriguez from the Chicago Police Department. I don't know if you remember me. Michael's chest tightened at the sound of the name. Rodriguez had been his commanding officer in the Community Intervention Unit, the man who had tried to talk him out of resigning, who had stood in the doorway of his office and said that one mistake didn't define a career. I remember you, Captain. I'm calling because someone asked me to reach out. Someone who's been following your work at Chen Ventures. Rodriguez paused, and in that pause, Michael heard the weight of something unspoken. Rebecca Morrison wants to meet with you. The name hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca Morrison, the woman whose face he still saw in his nightmares, sometimes swollen and broken tubes running from her arms in the harsh light of the hospital room. The woman he had failed to save. She's been in touch with you. She works with a domestic violence support organization now. She saw an article about the community impact work you're doing, recognized your name. She asked me to facilitate contact. Another pause. She doesn't blame you, Michael. She never did. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the past rush back with all its jagged edges. What does she want? To talk, that's all. She said there are things she needs you to hear. After the call ended, Michael sat motionless at his desk for a long time. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see his colleagues moving through their days, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted in his world. The list of names from Morrison Manufacturing still hung on his wall, 212 reminders of why this work mattered. But there was one name that had never been on that list, one face that haunted him more than all the others combined. Rebecca Morrison. He had spent 4 years running from what happened to her, had built an entire new life on the foundation of that failure, convinced himself that the only way to honor her suffering was to make sure he never had the chance to fail anyone else the same way. But maybe that had been its own kind of cowardice. Maybe the real courage was not in hiding from the past, but in facing it. That evening, he told his father about the call. They were in Walter's workshop, the rocking chair long finished, and now occupied by Sophie as she swung gently back and forth, humming to herself while they talked. "What are you going to do?" Walter's hands were busy with a new project, a jewelry box for Sophie's 8th birthday. "I don't know. Part of me wants to say no to keep that door closed. And the other part," Michael watched his daughter swing her small feet barely touching the floor with each pass. "The other part knows that I've been carrying this weight for 4 years. Maybe it's time to set it down." Walter nodded slowly. "Your mother used to say that the wounds we refuse to look at are the ones that never heal. She was right about most things. What if seeing her makes it worse? What if I can't handle what she has to say? Then you'll learn something about yourself. Either way, you'll know." Walter set down his tools and looked at his son with eyes that had seen war and loss in 50 years of life. Courage isn't about knowing you can handle something. It's about facing it anyway. Michael called Rodriguez back the next morning and asked him to arrange the meeting. They met at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, neutral territory, far from the South Side neighborhood where everything had happened. Michael arrived early, chose a table near the window where he could see the door and tried to steady his breathing as he waited. Rebecca Morrison walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. She looked different from the broken woman he remembered, different even from the photograph in the case file that had burned itself into his memory. Her hair was shorter now, shot through with early gray, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years of hard-won wisdom. But what struck him most was the way she carried herself, shoulders back and chin up, the posture of someone who had learned to claim space in the world. She spotted him immediately, and something passed across her face that might have been recognition or resolution. She crossed to his table and stood there for a moment, and Michael rose to meet her, not knowing what to say or do. "Michael Brennan," her voice was steady, stronger than he had expected. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Mrs. Morrison, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet. Just listen." They sat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop filled the silence, ordinary life continuing all around them, while something extraordinary hung in the air between their table. "I've thought about you for 4 years." Rebecca's words came slowly, carefully chosen. "At first I was angry, not at you specifically, but at everyone. The police who couldn't stop Kevin, the system that let him out on bail, the neighbors who heard the screaming and did nothing. You were just one face in a crowd of people who had failed me." Michael felt each word land like a blow deserved and necessary. "But then I started to heal, started to see things differently." Rebecca wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and Michael noticed faint scars on her wrists, pale lines that spoke of battles he couldn't imagine. "I went through therapy, joined a support group, eventually started working with other survivors, and somewhere along the way I realized something important." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "You were the only one who tried, the only one who saw me as a person that night, not just a case number. You talked to Kevin for almost an hour trying to calm him down. You asked me that if I was okay, and you actually waited for my answer. Do you remember what you said before you left?" Michael shook his head, not trusting his voice. "You said, if anything changes, call me directly. Here's my card." You gave me your personal number. No other cop had ever done that. Rebecca's voice caught slightly. "I didn't call that night because I was too scared, because Kevin was watching me, because I had learned over 7 years of marriage that any sign of resistance made things worse. But I kept that card. I still have it." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small rectangle of cardstock, worn soft at the edges. The print faded but still legible. Michael Brennan Community Intervention Unit. His old number, the one he had disconnected years ago. "When I was in the hospital, that card was in my pocket. The nurses found it when they were cutting off my clothes. One of them called the number for me, but it was already disconnected. You were already gone." The weight of those words settled over Michael like a physical thing. She had tried to reach him. In her darkest moment, she had reached for the one person who had shown her kindness, and he had already disappeared. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, hollow. "I'm so sorry." "I know you are. I could see it in your face that night, and I can see it now." Rebecca leaned forward. "But that's not why I wanted to meet you. I didn't come here for your apology." "Then why?" "Because I read about what you're doing now. The community impact work. making sure that business decisions don't destroy people's lives. And I recognize something in those stories. She paused. You're trying to save everyone you couldn't save before. You're trying to make up for what happened to me. Michael couldn't deny it. The truth was too obvious, too central to everything he had become. That's a heavy burden to carry, Rebecca's voice softened. Trying to fix the whole world because you couldn't fix one night. I know because I've done the same thing. Every woman I help at the shelter, every survivor I counsel, part of me, is trying to save the person I used to be. Does it help? Sometimes, but not in the way I expected. Rebecca smiled, and there was hard-won peace in it. The thing is, Michael, you can't change what happened right to me. No amount of good work will erase that night. What happened, happened. Kevin made his choices, and I made mine, and you made yours, and the world kept spinning. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of connection that shocked him with its generosity. But here's what I need you to understand. What happened to me was not your fault. You did everything right that night. You followed protocol. You showed compassion. You gave me resources and options. The fact that I couldn't use them, that Kevin was watching, that the system failed, none of that is on you. Michael felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 4 years. I've spent so long believing that if I had just stayed longer, seen more clearly, done something different. I know, I've had those same thoughts. What if I had left him sooner? What if I had called the police the first time he hit me? What if I had been stronger, smarter, braver? Rebecca shook her head. We can torture ourselves forever with what ifs, or we can accept that we did the best we could with what we knew and focus on doing better now. How do you do that? How do you let go? You don't let go. Not really. You just learn to carry it differently, to let it inform who you are without letting it define you. Rebecca sat back. You're not the cop who failed me, Michael. You're the man who cared enough to try. That's who you were that night, and from what I've read, that's who you still are. Don't let one night erase everything else. They talked for another hour. Rebecca told him about her work with the domestic violence organization, about the women she had helped escape situations like her own, about the strange gift that suffering had given her, the ability to sit with others in their pain without flinching. Michael told her about Chen Ventures, about Victoria's transformation, about the slow work of building a company that considered human cost alongside profit. When they finally stood to leave, Rebecca hugged him. It was brief and unexpected, and it broke something loose in Cheryl that he had not known was still trapped. Thank you, his voice was rough, for finding me, for telling me this. Thank you for listening, and Michael, one more thing. Rebecca stepped back, her eyes bright. That little girl of yours, the one I read about in the article. Sophie. She's lucky to have a father who cares so much about doing right by people. Don't ever let her forget that. Michael drove home through streets that looked different somehow, sharper and more real. The weight he had carried for 4 years was still there, but it had shifted, transformed into something he could live with rather than something that crushed him. Rebecca Morrison had given him a gift he had not known he needed, the gift of forgiveness he had never thought to ask for. That evening, he sat Sophie down and told her a story. Not the full story, she was too young for that, but a version she could understand. A story about a man who made a mistake and spent years being sad about it until someone he had hurt came to tell him it was okay to stop being sad. Did the man feel better after that? Sophie asked, her eyes wide. He felt different, like he could breathe again. That's good. I don't like it when people can't breathe. Michael hugged her tight, this small person who had become his reason for everything. Me neither, sweetheart. Me neither. The weeks that followed Rebecca's visit brought a shift in Michael's approach to his work. Where before he had been driven by guilt, by the desperate need to atone for past failures, now he found himself motivated by something purer. He still cared about the impact of Chen Ventures' decisions, still fought to ensure that communities were considered alongside profits. But the frantic edge was gone, replaced by a steadier purpose. Victoria noticed the change almost immediately. Something's different about you. She said this during one of their weekly meetings, studying him with the keen perception that made her such an effective leader. You seem lighter somehow. I met with someone from my past, someone I thought I had failed. Turns out she had a different perspective. And that helped. More than I can explain. Victoria nodded slowly. I've been thinking about my own past lately. The decisions I made, the people I hurt without knowing. Morrison Manufacturing was just the one that came to light. There were others. What are you going to do about them? What you taught me to do, face them, make amends where I can, except that some damage can't be undone, but that doesn't mean I have to keep causing more. Victoria paused. My father used to say that regret is interest paid on a debt you can't repay. The only way out is to stop accruing new debt. Michael smiled at the wisdom in those words. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was. I spent so many years trying to exceed his success that I forgot to learn from his character. That's changing now. Victoria stood and moved to the window looking out at the city below. I want to do something bigger, Michael. Something that puts our money where our mouth is. What do you have in mind? Victoria turned back to face him, and in her eyes, he saw the fire of conviction. The South Side Development Project, the one we've been evaluating for 3 months. I want to restructure it completely. Keep the existing residents in place, renovate instead of demolish. Create community ownership stakes so they benefit from the development instead of being displaced by it. That will cost significantly more. The returns will be lower. I know. I've run the numbers. We'll still make money, just not as much. But we'll also create something lasting. Something my father would have been proud of. Michael felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had transformed so completely in the 14 months he had known her. She had started as the ice queen of Chicago finance, a woman who made decisions by spreadsheet without ever seeing the humans behind the data. Now she was proposing to sacrifice profits for principles to put community welfare ahead of shareholder returns. The board won't like it. The board will learn to like it, or they'll find another CEO. Victoria's jaw was set with determination. I'm done building a company that succeeds by hurting people. If that means smaller returns, so be it. I'd rather be proud of what I've built than rich from what I've destroyed. The Southside project became Michael's primary focus over the following months. He spent weeks in the community meeting with residents, listening to their concerns, understanding what they needed and feared. He worked with architects and planners to redesign the development in ways that preserved the neighborhood's character while still creating economic opportunity. It was the hardest work he had ever done and the most rewarding. Every compromise required negotiation. Every decision had consequences that rippled outward in ways he couldn't always predict. But slowly, painstakingly, a vision began to take shape. The old apartment buildings would be renovated rather than demolished. A community land trust would give residents ownership stakes in the development. Local businesses would receive priority for retail spaces. A training center would prepare community members for the construction jobs the project would create. Marcus Williams, the 72-year-old who had lived in one of the buildings for 50 years, became Michael's unofficial advisor. He knew everyone in the neighborhood understood its history and its rhythms, and his endorsement carried weight that no amount of corporate promises could match. You're different from the others. Marcus said this during one of their many conversations sitting on the stoop of his building while children played in the street. The other developers, they came in with their plans already made, told us what was going to happen like our opinions didn't matter. You actually listen. Listening is the only way to do this right. Maybe, but most people don't bother. It's easier to make decisions for people than with them. Marcus studied Michael with eyes that had seen decades of broken promises. Why do you care so much? Because I spent too many years not caring enough. Because I've seen what happens when people get treated like numbers instead of humans. Because I have a daughter and I want her to grow up in a world where people matter. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a good answer. Most people give me speeches about community development and economic opportunity. You give me your daughter. The project launched in the fall 2 years after Michael had first walked into Chen Ventures. The groundbreaking ceremony was small by corporate standards, no politicians making speeches, no giant checks being presented. Just the community members who would be most affected, the workers who would do the building, and the Chen Ventures team who had made it possible. Victoria spoke briefly about her father, about the values he had instilled in her, about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Michael stood in the crowd with Sophie beside him, watching as years of work began to take physical form. Daddy, is this what you do at your job? Sophie was 9 now, tall enough that she no longer needed to be lifted to see over crowds. This is part of it, helping make sure that when buildings go up, the people who live here don't get pushed out. That's important. I think so. I'm proud of you. The words hit Michael harder than he expected. He looked down at his daughter, this person who saw him more clearly than anyone, and felt the full weight of what he had accomplished. Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know. Later that evening, Michael drove to his father's house. Walter was in the workshop as always, this time working on a hope chest for Sophie's future, something she would take with her when she left home someday. I saw the news coverage. Walter gestured to an old television mounted in the corner of the workshop, something he never watched, except for special occasions. Looked like quite an event. It felt like a culmination, like everything I've done since leaving the force was leading to this moment. And how does that feel? Michael considered the question carefully. It feels like I finally understand what Mom meant when she used to talk about purpose. Not the big dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from doing work that matters day after day, even when no one's watching. Walter set down his tools and turned to face his son fully. Your mother would be so proud of you. I hope you know that. I do. I feel her sometimes in moments like today, like she's watching. She is. I believe that. Walter's voice was rough with emotion. And I want you to know something. Watching you become the man, you are seeing you raise that little girl, building something meaningful with your life after everything you went through. It's the greatest gift I could have asked for. You are my legacy, Michael. Everything good that I tried to be, you've become. Michael embraced his father, holding tight to this man who had taught him everything he knew about honor and perseverance and the quiet courage of showing up every day. Thank you, Dad, for never giving up on me. Never could, never will. They stood there in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the evidence of a lifetime of craftsmanship, 2 generations connected by blood and choice, and the lessons passed from father to son. Outside, the autumn sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Another day ending, another chapter closing, but the story was far from over. The autumn light fell golden through the workshop windows 3 years to the day since Michael had first stepped into Chen Ventures. Sophie was 10 now, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her hands moving with careful concentration as Walter guided her through the delicate art of wood finishing. The rocking chair that had once been built for her now sat in the corner, too small for her growing frame, but kept as a testament to the grandfather who had crafted it with love. Michael stood in the doorway watching them, this image of legacy in motion. His father's hands, weathered by 7 decades of work, gently correcting the angle of Sophie's grip on the polishing cloth. His daughter's face scrunched in concentration, determined to get it right. 3 generations connected by sawdust and patience and the quiet transmission of knowledge that had nothing to do with words. Like this, Grandpa. Exactly like that. Feel how the wood responds? It tells you where it needs more attention. It feels warm. That's the oil bringing out its life. Wood holds memory, Sophie. Every ring is a year of the tree's existence. When we finish it properly, we honor all those years. Michael felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. A message from Victoria. Board meeting in 2 hours. Big news to share. Don't be late. He typed a quick acknowledgement and returned his attention to the workshop. Whatever Victoria had to announce could wait. This moment, this ordinary Saturday morning ritual of grandfather teaching granddaughter was worth more than any corporate milestone. Walter looked up and caught Michael's eye. Something passed between them, an understanding that needed no explanation. The old man nodded almost imperceptibly, then returned his focus to Sophie's work. Now we let it rest. The wood needs time to absorb what we've given it. How long? As long as it takes. Patience is the hardest skill to learn, but it's the most important. Sophie set down the cloth and examined her work with critical eyes. It doesn't look that different yet. The best changes are the ones you can't see right away. They happen slowly, layer by layer, until one day you look and realize everything is transformed. Michael stepped fully into the workshop, the familiar scent of sawdust and linseed oil wrapping around him like a homecoming. That sounds like something Mom would have said. Walter smiled, and in that smile, Michael saw decades of love and loss and persistence. Where do you think I learned it? The drive downtown took longer than usual, Saturday traffic complicated by a street festival that Michael had forgotten was happening. He used the time to think about the past 3 years, the changes that had accumulated like the layers of finish on Sophie's wood project. Chen Ventures had become something genuinely different. The community impact protocols he had developed were now industry standards copied by competitors who had once mocked them as naive idealism. The Southside development had become a model for equitable urban renewal studied by planning departments from New York to Los Angeles. Victoria had been featured in Forbes and Bloomberg not for her company's profits, though those remained strong, but for her philosophy of stakeholder capitalism. And Michael himself had changed in ways he was still discovering. The guilt that had driven him for so long had transformed into something healthier, a commitment to doing better, rather than an obsession with past failures. He still thought about Rebecca Morrison sometimes, but now when he did, he remembered her words about carrying weight differently, rather than the image of her broken face in the hospital. The Chen Ventures building rose before him, glass and steel, reaching toward a sky that threatened rain. He parked and made his way inside, nodding to the security guard, who had known him for 3 years now, taking the elevator to the 15th floor, where the executive offices hummed with weekend activity. Victoria's assistant directed him to the main conference room, where the senior leadership team was already assembled. The mood was celebratory, champagne bottles visible on the side table, but Victoria herself appeared more contemplative than triumphant. "Michael, good, we can begin." Victoria stood at the head of the table, a projection screen behind her displaying the Chen Ventures logo. "I wanted you all here for this announcement because what I'm about to share is the result of work that every person in this room contributed to." She clicked to the next slide. A certificate from the National Association for Responsible Investment, ornate borders surrounding text that Michael had to read twice to believe. Chen Ventures has been selected as the investment firm of the year for social impact. We're the first mid-sized firm ever to receive this recognition. The award ceremony is in Washington next month. Applause erupted around the table. Victoria accepted it graciously but raised her hand for quiet. This matters because it proves something that many people said was impossible, that you can pursue profit and principle simultaneously. That considering community impact doesn't have to mean accepting inferior returns. That doing business differently isn't just ethical, it's smart. She looked directly at Michael. 3 years ago, I hired a waiter to tell me uncomfortable truths. Most people thought I had lost my mind. But that waiter, that former police officer, who had the courage to see humanity in people others had written off, he changed the culture of this company. He changed me. Victoria's voice caught slightly. My father spent his life pressing other people's shirts. He never made more than $40,000 in a year. But he understood something that I had forgotten, that the measure of a person isn't what they accumulate, but what they contribute. Michael Brennan helped me remember that. This award belongs to him as much as anyone. Michael felt heat rising to his face as his colleagues turned to look at him. He had never been comfortable with recognition, preferred to work in the background, to let results speak for themselves. But Victoria was not finished. Which brings me to my second announcement. Effective immediately, I am promoting Michael to Chief Impact Officer. He will report directly to me and have authority over all community relations decisions across our portfolio. This isn't just a title change. It's a statement about our values and our future. The applause was louder this time, and Michael found himself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations. Through the crowd, he caught Victoria's eye, and she gave him a small nod that communicated more than any speech could. Later, after the champagne had been drunk and the conference room had emptied, Michael and Victoria stood at the window looking out at the city. The threatened rain had arrived, streaking the glass with patterns that blurred the lights below. "You didn't have to do that." Michael's voice was quiet. The speech, the promotion. "I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because it's true." Victoria turned to face him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night on the patio behind the restaurant?" "I said a lot of things. You said that there's a difference between making someone listen and making them a target. That we could either keep hurting each other or try to understand." Victoria paused. "I had forgotten how to understand. You reminded me." "You were ready to be reminded." "Maybe, but it took someone with the courage to speak the truth for that readiness to matter." Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, the same one that had hung in her office for years. My father worked himself to death in a laundry. I told myself that my success honored his sacrifice. But the truth is, I had betrayed everything he believed in. He treated every customer like family. I treated communities like line items. She handed Michael the photograph. Joseph Chen's face smiled up at him, young and hopeful, standing before the laundry that would claim his life. Keep this. Display it somewhere visible. Let it remind you why this work matters. Michael looked at the photograph for a long moment and feeling the weight of what it represented. A father's sacrifice, a daughter's redemption, the long chain of consequence and choice that connected generations. I have something similar. He reached for his phone and pulled up a photo of his own taken years ago at Walter's workshop. His father at the workbench, young Michael beside him, both of them covered in sawdust and grinning at the camera. My dad took me to his workshop every Saturday from the time I could walk, taught me that the things we build with our hands are the things that last. Victoria studied the image with something like recognition. We're not so different, are we? Both of us trying to honor fathers who gave us everything. Maybe that's why this works. We understand the weight of legacy. They stood in comfortable silence as the rain continued to fall. Two people from vastly different worlds united by a shared understanding of what mattered most. The call from Walter came 3 days later, late on a Tuesday evening when Michael was putting Sophie to bed. His father's voice carried an unusual gravity, something beneath the words that Michael couldn't quite identify. I need to show you something. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon, bring Sophie? Is everything okay? Everything's fine, better than fine. There's just something I've been waiting to share with you. I think you're finally ready to see it. Michael agreed without pressing for details. In 68 years, Walter Brennan had earned the right to his own timing. The next afternoon found the three of them in Walter's workshop, Sophie exploring the corner where her grandfather kept interesting scraps of wood, while Michael waited for his father to reveal whatever had prompted the mysterious summons. Walter moved slowly to a high shelf that Michael had never thought to examine, reaching behind a row of old coffee cans to retrieve a wooden box that looked handmade. He carried it to his workbench and set it down with deliberate care. This box holds the most important things I own. Not valuable in any way the world would recognize, but precious to me. Walter ran his fingers over the lid. I've been waiting for the right time to share this with you. After what I've watched you become these past few years, I think that time is now. He opened the box and Michael leaned closer to see what was inside. Photographs, letters, medals, a collection of items that clearly spanned decades. Walter began laying them out on the workbench, narrating as he went. My service medals. Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart for the shrapnel in my leg that still aches when it rains. These I've shown you before. He set them aside and picked up a yellowed photograph. But this I've never shown anyone except your mother. The photograph showed a young Walter in military fatigues standing beside an older Vietnamese man in simple farmer's clothing. They were in front of a small house with a thatched roof, and despite the obvious differences in their circumstances, there was a warmth in the image that transcended culture and conflict. This man saved my life. Walter's voice was rough. His name was Nguyen Van Min. He was a rice farmer in a village about 40 kilometers from Da Nang. Michael took the photograph carefully, studying the face of the man who had apparently preserved his father's existence. You've never told me about him. I've never told anyone the full story. It was too important to share casually, and I was waiting for you to understand what it meant. Walter sat down heavily on his workbench stool. In the spring of 1969, my patrol was ambushed. I took shrapnel in my leg and went down. When the shooting stopped, my unit was gone. They thought I was dead, or maybe they were too scared to come back for me. Either way, I was alone in enemy territory with a wound that would kill me if I didn't get help. Sophie had stopped her exploration and was listening with wide eyes. Walter smiled at her and continued. I crawled for hours until I found a village. I was ready to die. I expected that if anyone found me, they would finish what the ambush had started. But instead, I found Min. He picked up another item from the box, a small jade pendant on a leather cord. He was coming back from his rice field when he saw me collapse by the road. He could have left me there. He could have turned me over to the Viet Cong who controlled the area. Instead, he carried me to his home and hid me in a space beneath his floor. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he held the pendant. For 2 weeks he cared for me. His wife cleaned my wound with herbs and rice wine. His children brought me food even though they barely had enough for themselves. Every day, Min risked his life and the lives of everyone he loved to keep an American soldier alive. Michael felt the weight of the story settling over him, understanding beginning to dawn about why his father had never shared this before. When I was strong enough to travel, Min led me through the jungle to a place where I could signal my unit. The last thing he said to me was this. Walter held up the jade pendant. He gave me this and said, "We are enemies because our countries tell us to be. But underneath, we are just men trying to take care of our families. Remember that, American. Remember that the man you are taught to hate might be the one who saves your life." Silence filled the workshop. Sophie had crept closer, her hand finding Michael's. I never saw Min again. After the war, I tried to find him, hired people to search, wrote letters to every organization I could think of. The village was destroyed. Most of the records were lost. I never learned if he survived. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. For 50 years, I've carried his words with me. Every time I was tempted to see someone as an enemy, I remembered Min. Every time I wanted to give up on a person because they were different from me, I remembered the farmer who looked past my uniform and saw a human being who needed help. He looked at Michael with an intensity that made his son's heart race. That's why I've watched your journey with such hope. When you talked to those men on the patio, when you saw past their anger to their pain, you were doing what Min taught me. When you built programs that considered the human cost of business decisions, you were honoring his legacy without even knowing it. Walter pressed the jade pendant into Michael's hand. I want you to have this. Pass it to Sophie someday. Let it remind you both that our enemies are only enemies until we choose to see them differently. That the greatest courage isn't in fighting, it's in understanding. Michael looked down at the small piece of jade, this fragment of a story that explains so much about who his father was. The quiet strength, the willingness to see good in everyone, the patient teaching that had shaped Michael's own character. Dad, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just keep being who you are. Keep seeing people the way Min saw me. Walter's voice steadied. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not furniture or property or money. Just the understanding that we're all connected. That kindness matters. That one person's choice to help can change everything. Sophie tugged at Michael's hand. Daddy, what happened to the farmer? Did he ever find out that Grandpa was okay? Walter smiled at his granddaughter with profound tenderness. I don't know, sweetheart, but I hope so. I hope somehow he knew that the American soldier he saved went home and raised a family and taught his son and granddaughter to be good people. I hope he knew that his kindness rippled out through generations. Maybe we could try to find his family, Sophie said, with the simple problem-solving logic of a child. With computers and the internet now, maybe we could find someone who remembers him. Michael looked at his father, seeing the hope kindle in the old man's eyes. Maybe we could. Michael squeezed Sophie's hand. Maybe that's exactly what we should do. The gathering took place 2 months later on a Saturday evening when the autumn had fully surrendered to winter. Michael had transformed his father's backyard into a celebration, space string lights fighting back the early darkness, heaters creating pockets of warmth against the December chill. The guest list was unusual by any standard. Frank Donovan stood by the drinks table, his wife beside him, both of them looking relaxed in a way that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. Eddie Martinez had brought his son, reunited after the painful separation that had once seemed permanent. Ray Kowalski's daughter was there, having graduated from college the previous spring with an engineering degree that her father's new career had helped pay for. Tom Hendricks came with several people from the workforce development program he now directed. Victoria Chen arrived alone but not lonely, stopping to speak with each person she passed, asking about their families and their work with genuine interest that would have been impossible for the woman she had been before. And in the corner of the yard, seated in a wheelchair but beaming with joy, was a woman named Tran Nguyen. She was 73 years old, had lived in San Jose for 40 years, and was the daughter of Nguyen Van Min. Sophie had been right. The internet had made possible what decades of searching had failed to accomplish. A genealogy website, a DNA database, a series of emails that had built to a video call that had reduced Walter Brennan to tears. Min had survived, the war had emigrated to America in 1979, and had lived in California until his death in 2003. He had never stopped wondering about the American soldier he had saved. His daughter had grown up hearing the story, had taught it to her own children, had always hoped that someday she would learn what had become of the man her father had risked everything to help. Now she was here in Walter's backyard, representing the completion of a circle that had begun in blood and violence half a century ago. Michael stood at the edge of the gathering, watching his father and Tran deep in conversation. Their words were inaudible from this distance, but their body language spoke of recognition and gratitude and the profound relief of finally knowing. Victoria appeared beside him. "This is beautiful, what you've done here. It wasn't me, it was Sophie's idea. In my father's story, I just helped connect the dots." "That's what you do. Connect dots that other people don't even see." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about legacy a lot lately, about what we leave behind." "Any conclusions?" "Just that the things that matter most are the things we can't measure. The relationships we build, the kindness we show, the people we help become better versions of themselves." Victoria looked at Tran, at Walter, at the unlikely assembly of former strangers who had become something like family. "My father never saw this, never saw what his sacrifice made possible, but somehow I think he knows anyway." Frank Donovan approached them, a beer in his hand and peace on his face. "Hell of a party, Brennan. Hell of a journey to get here. 3 years ago, I was ready to do something stupid, was convinced that burning everything down was the only option. If you hadn't stepped in that night," Frank shook his head, "I don't like to think about where I'd be now. You would have found your way. The anger was real, but so was the hope. You just needed someone to help you see the hope. Maybe." Frank raised his beer in a small salute. "But you were the one who did the helping. That matters. It matters more than you know." Sophie bounded over, interrupting the adult conversation with the cheerful obliviousness of a 10-year-old. "Daddy Grandpa says it's time for the toast." Michael made his way to where Walter stood beside Tron, a glass of champagne in his hand. The old man's eyes were bright with tears he didn't try to hide. "I'm not much for speeches." Walter's voice carried across the gathered crowd. "I've spent my life letting my hands do the talking. But tonight calls for words." He looked at Tran, then at Michael, then at Sophie, who had pressed herself against his side. 55 years ago, a man I was supposed to consider my enemy saved my life. He didn't know me, had no reason to help me, but he saw past the uniform, past the war, past everything that told him I was his enemy, and he saw a human being in need. Walter's hand found Tran's and clasped it gently. That act of courage, that choice to see humanity instead of hate, it changed everything. It changed who I became. It changed how I raised my son. It changed what I taught my granddaughter. He looked at Sophie, and it led somehow to all of us standing here tonight. His gaze swept across the gathering, touching on each face. We are all connected. Every choice we make ripples out in ways we can't predict. The kindness we show today might save a life tomorrow. The understanding we offer might heal wounds we never even see. Walter raised his glass. To Nguyen Van Min, who taught me what courage really means. To his daughter Tron, who carries his legacy forward. And to all of you who prove every day that people can change, that communities can heal, that it's never too late to become who we were meant to be. The toast was drunk, hugs were exchanged, tears were shed without embarrassment. Later, as the party began to wind down, Michael found himself standing with his father on the back porch, looking out at the gathering that had transformed the yard into something magical. "I'm proud of you, son." Walter's voice was soft. "Prouder than I've ever said. You've said it plenty. Not enough. Never enough." Walter turned to face Michael fully. "When you left the police force, I worried. Not because you made the wrong choice, but because I was afraid you'd let one failure define your whole life. Your mother and I, we always knew you had something special. That ability to see people, really see them. I was afraid you'd bury that gift. I almost did. But you didn't. You found your way back to it. Found a way to use it that helps people without putting yourself at risk the way police work did." Walter put his hand on Michael's shoulder. "That takes a different kind of courage. The courage to try again after you've failed. The courage to believe in yourself when everything tells you not to." Sophie appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from running around with the other children. Daddy, can I ask you something? Always. She came to stand between them, looking up at her father with an expression of unusual seriousness. Are you happy now? Michael knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in his. I am, sweetheart, very happy. Because you used to look sad sometimes, like you were carrying something heavy, but you don't look like that anymore. I was carrying something heavy for a long time, but I learned to set it down. What was it? Michael thought about how to answer. It was worry. Worry that I wasn't good enough. Worry that I would make mistakes and hurt people. Worry that I didn't deserve to be happy. That's silly. Sophie's voice was matter of fact. You're the best person I know. You help people all the time, and everyone deserves to be happy. Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. When did you get so wise? Grandpa taught me. Sophie grinned up at Walter. He says wisdom is just paying attention and remembering what you learn. Walter laughed a full and joyous sound that seemed to push back the winter darkness. She's got me there. The three of them stood together as the last guest departed, waving goodbye to Tran and promising to visit her in California soon. When everyone had gone, they returned to the empty backyard string lights, still twinkling against the night sky. 3 generations, Walter said it like a prayer. Everything I've learned, everything I hope to pass on, it's all right here. Michael looked at his father, then at his daughter, feeling the weight of connection that bound them together. Grandpa, will you tell me more about the farmer? Sophie's voice was sleepy now. About how he saved you. I'll tell you everything, sweetheart. Every story I remember. And someday you'll tell your children. And they'll tell theirs. That's how we keep the people we love alive, through the stories we pass down. They went inside, Sophie already half asleep on Michael's shoulder. He carried her to the guest room that Walter always kept ready, tucked her in with the same gentle care his father had shown him decades ago. When he returned to the living room, Walter was sitting in his favorite chair, staring at the jade pendant that had once belonged to Nguyen Van Min. Keep it. Walter held it out. I was wrong to say wait until I'm gone. You should have it now. Carry it with you. Let it remind you every day why we do what we do. Michael took the pendant and slipped it around his neck. The jade was cool against his chest, but warmed quickly to his body heat. Thank you, Dad, for everything. Thank you, son, for becoming exactly who I always knew you could be. They embraced, and in that embrace was everything that couldn't be said, love and pride and gratitude in the deep abiding connection that bound generations together. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. Inside, the fire crackled. And in the guest room, Sophie dreamed of farmers and soldiers and the miraculous possibility of enemies becoming friends. The story that had begun in violence was ending in peace. The legacy that had started with one man's courage was continuing through those who carried it forward. And Michael Brennan, who had once believed himself a failure, finally understood what success really meant. It meant showing up. It meant caring. It meant seeing the humanity in everyone, even those the world told you to hate. It meant building something that would outlast you. It meant love. Always above everything else, it meant love.